Look at this map. Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, Oman, Yemen. That cross-chair you see, that is not a military targeting system. That is our description of economic geography. The Gulf Cooperation Council sits at the center of the world's most consequential energy checkpoint. On February 28, 2026, US and Israeli forces launched coordinated strikes on Iran. And within 96 hours, every country marked on this map was dealing with the consequences, including the ones that had nothing to do with starting the war. I am Dr. Mohey-ud-din. I am a senior economic planner working in Saudi Arabia. This is Beyond the Number series, and today we are going to examine exactly what this conflict is doing to the Gulf economy and what it means for the global economic order. The moment you hear Middle East conflict and oil in the same sentence, an instinct fires, oil prices up. Gulf states win. Simple. That instinct is wrong on every dimension. Let me show you why. Myth 1. Oil prices up means Gulf wins. The reality, export disruptions, cancels the price gain entirely. You cannot book revenue on oil. You cannot ship. Myth 2. This is a military story. The reality. This is an economic stress test of 3 global systems simultaneously, and most of the financial pressure is missing that entirely. Myth 3. The GCC is insulated from this conflict. The reality is that the GCC is on the front line, uninvited, unprovoked, and now paying the bill. Everything in this video flows from these 3 corrections. Keep them in your mind as we go through the data. Let me give you the economic timeline because speed matters here. Day 0, February 28, US and Israeli forces strikes. Iran's supreme leader Khamenei is killed within hours. Day 1, March 1st, Iran retaliates, and crucially, it doesn't only strike Israel. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain all are struck. Countries that launched no attack, countries that asked for none of this. Day 5, March 4. Hormuz is effectively closed. Day 5, March 4th. Hormuz is effectively closed. 20 million barrels of the oil per day, 1/5 of the global daily consumption, removed from the market, plus 20% of the global LNG within 96 hours of that closure. Global equity market loses $3.2 trillion. Day 7, March 6. Oil crosses $90 a barrel, already 29% above the pre-war price of $70. 40,000 flights are cancelled. Dubai International Airport, the world's busiest one, goes offline indefinitely. Day 14, March 13th. Oil crosses $112. A single Iranian strike hits a major Qatari LNG facility, destroying 17% of Qatar's export capacity in one afternoon. Day 28, March 27th, the WTO revises its 2026 growth is now projected at approximately 2.6%, down from the 4.5% before the conflict. 28 days from the functioning global energy system to this. Now, here is the core economic paradox of this conflict, and it is the thing that almost no financial commentary is getting right. Look at this diagram. On the left, $100 plus oil prices and high global demand. On the right, Hormuz closed. In the middle, a bottleneck. Saudi Arabia has one alternative export route, the East-West pipeline. Its maximum capacity is 5 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia's total export requirement is more than double that gap. More than 10 million barrels per day is stranded. It is sitting in the Gulf with nowhere to go. So what you have is not a windfall. You have the GCC paradox, the world's highest oil prices and world's most disrupted export revenues. And at exactly the same time, price is not revenue. Revenue requires exports. And when Hormuz is closed, that pipeline is all you have, and it is not enough. The macro data is now confirming what the economics predicted. Look at what Goldman Sachs is projecting if this war continues through the end of April. Kuwait and Qatar, GDP contraction of minus 14%. That is not a slowdown, that is collapse. UAE minus 5%, Saudi Arabia minus 3%. And these are not the worst case outlier scenarios. These are the baseline projection from one of the world's most respected financial institutions based on the conflict trajectory as of mid-March. The overall GCC average growth forecast has already been revised from 4.5% pre-war down to approximately 2.6%. And that revision came before the full severity of the Hormuz closure was fully priced in by international institutions. The high oil price narrative is not just wrong, it is precisely backwards. The mechanism that should be generating a windfall, rising prices, is being cancelled by the mechanism Iran has weaponized, export denial. Now let's talk about the real shock. The one that is getting almost no attention in the financial press. The GCC's vulnerability is not oil, it is dependency. 70 to 85% of GCC food is imported, and the majority of those shipments pass through or near the Strait of Hormuz. When Hormuz closes, the Gulf faces an inflation shock from two directions simultaneously. Look at the flow on the right side of this slide. 16% of global fertilizer trade has been blocked. That means global crop production costs surge. That feeds into the higher import prices of everything the GCC buys from the outside. And at the same time, shipping insurance costs are surging because no insurer wants exposure in an active war zone. The result at the bottom, GCC inflation spike arriving on the top of already reduced government revenue. 20% of global LNG is now off the market. 17% of the Qatar's LNG export capacity was destroyed in a single strike. GCC was not built with the food self-sufficiency as a strategic priority, the choice made over decades. It's now a structural vulnerability in an era of active conflict. Look at this map. Those gold lines are the Gulf aviation network, the connectivity that makes Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi transit hub of the world. Dubai International handled 95.2 million passengers in 2025. It served 291 destinations. It sat at the center of the most aviation corridor on earth, linking Europe to Asia, Africa to Americas. All of that is now offline. Hamad International in Doha disrupted, Abu Dhabi International disrupted, Dubai offline, 40,000 flights cancelled, the Gulf's connection to the global economy surged. And here is the strategic insight I want you to take from this slide. Iran's asymmetric strategy is not targeting the Gulf's military capacity. It is targeting the Gulf's economic logic, the logic of stability, openness, and connectivity. The three pillars on which the Vision 2030, UAE Vision 2071, and Qatar's diversification strategy all rest. This is not the collateral damage. This is the strategy. This slide contains what I think is the single most important data point in this entire conflict, and you will not find it in the most coverage. Look at the scales. On the left, Iran's strike campaign, Shahid drone at $20,000 to $50,000 per unit. Total campaign expenditure between $194 million and $391 million. On the right, the UAE's air defense response, Patriot PAC-3 interceptor at $3 to $5 million each. Total air defense expenditure in the first weeks between 1.3 and $2.6 billion. Iran spent at most $391 million. The UAE spent up to $2.6 billion defending against it. That is 13 times more spent defending than attacking. And this is not a tactical imbalance that better planning can fix. This is a structural asymmetry built into the physics of modern drone warfare versus the interceptor economics. Iran can sustain this indefinitely without structural reform to its security architecture. This asymmetry will outlast the conflict. It is one of the reasons this war, however it ends militarily, represents a structural turning point. That bolt through the skyline tells the story better than any data table. Every vision program in GCC, Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, UAE's Vision 2071, Qatar's national vision rests on a single shared assumption at its foundation, that is stability. Not just a political stability, the perception of stability, the kind of stability that makes the foreign capital flows in, that makes global talent choose Dubai over Singapore, that makes mega project financing terms attractive, that makes sovereign risk profile looks creditworthy to the international investors. Look at what each vision requires through that lens. Saudi Arabia's NEOM and its mega project need stable long-term sovereign financing and foreign capital. UAE's knowledge economy and AI ambitions depend on talent retention, and talent moves to safe cities. Qatar's LNG and finance hub model requires reliable energy infrastructure, and 17% of the LNG export capacity was destroyed in a single. The question I want you to sit with is this: it is not whether the NEOM gets built on time. The question is whether the entire premise of the vision style transformation remains viable in an era where the Gulf's infrastructure is legitimate military target. That is the categorically different risk environment than the one these programs were designed for. This slide is about a deal that has governed global finance since 1973. Look at the cycle on the left. The old deal. The GCC prices oil in US dollar. It recycles the resulting surplus back into the US assets. Treasuries, bonds, dollar denominated instruments. In exchange, the United States provides the security umbrella that makes the Gulf safe. Enough to do business. That cycle is represented by the intact loop on the left. The explosion in the middle represents what happened in 2026. The US launched a unilateral war. The GCC had no role in designing it, no vote in triggering it, and no option to opt out of its consequences. Gulf states bore direct kinetic cost: port infrastructure, airport operation, LNG facilities, drinking water system. Qatar's Prime Minister asked the question publicly: what are the American interests in the Qatar's drinking water? The question is not just rhetorical. It represents a fundamental reassessment happening at the highest level of Gulf policymaking. At the arrow on the right side of this slide tells you whether that resentment is heading, accelerating non-dollar specifically, yuan oil settlements, discussion with China and Asian partners. This is not a sudden break. It is a structural drift that we already underway before February 2026. But this conflict has accelerated by years, perhaps by decades. I want to be precise about what I am saying in this section because the prescience matter here. Left column is confirmed current reality. The right column is the forward-looking structural thesis. I will be clear about which is which. Pakistan's immediate vulnerability is real and documented. Chatham House has specifically identified Pakistan as one of the emerging market economies most exposed to this energy price shock. A fragile fiscal position, an active IMF program that leaves almost no buffer against oil import surge, high hydrocarbon dependency, GCC remittances flow that are now potentially disrupted as the Gulf itself absorbs the shock. That is the left column, and it is not speculative. The right column is my structural thesis. Pakistan shares the border with Iran. It has a deep diplomatic ties to the GCC, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, built over the decade of the labor migration and financial flows. It has a historic role as a bridge between the Arab world and the broader Muslim bloc. It has precedent. Pakistan played exactly this kind of back-channel intermediary role in 1970 and 1980s. The structural condition for Pakistan to move from peripheral player to active intermediary exist. Whether the current government has the bandwidth, the institutional capacity, and the political will to convert those structural assets into the actual diplomatic capital, that is a separate question. and an open one. I present this as a thesis, not a fact, but the structural geography is real. A researcher quoted by Al Jazeera described the GCC position as being between the hammer and a nail. That Y junction you see on the screen is exactly that. Two paths, neither of them clean. Option A: stay US aligned, maintain the security umbrella, keep hosting American forces. The benefit: the deterrence architecture remain intact. The cost: you remain targeted as a US proxy. You continue paying the kinetic cost for the unilateral American decisions that you had no hand in the making. The UAE paid up to $2.6 billion in the first weeks alone for a war it didn't start. Option B: distance from the United States, pursue the strategic autonomy. The appeal is obvious after what the GCC has experienced. The problem: you create a security vacuum that is not easily filled. China's diplomatic footprint is expanding, but China is not a military guarantor in the way the US has been. The GCC's own defense architecture is not yet capable of standing alone. And here is the core logic that makes both options painful. Iran's asymmetric strategy doesn't need to win a military victory. It doesn't need to destroy the US Gulf alliance. It simply needs the cost of hosting US power to become prohibitively to become high, economically, structurally, reputationally. This slide is the analytical frame I want you to carry away from this video. Three systems, three simultaneous stress tests on one conflict. Circle 1. The GCC model, stability driven growth. The premise of the geopolitical institution has been pierced. Status under acute stress. Circle 2. Petrodollar system. The security for dollar trade-off that has underpinned dollar hegemony since 1973. Non-dollar settlement discussions are accelerating. US asset concentration in sovereign wealth funds is under review. Status structural drift. Circle 3. Emerging middle powers. Countries like Pakistan with strategic geography and diplomatic reach, historically unable to convert those assets into economic leverage. The structural condition now exists for that to change. Status opportunity, if capacity exists. At the center, where all three circles overlap, is what this conflict may ultimately produce: a new economic geography, one in which the old assumptions about energy flow, financial architecture, and regional security arrangements no longer hold. We do not know yet what replaces them, but we know the old map is being redrawn. The war will end. Every war does. The question is not whether. The question is what remains when it does. Three questions I want to leave you with. First, can stability-driven diversification survive a precedent of direct kinetic attack on Gulf economic infrastructure? It has happened once airports and LNG facilities and water system have been struck. The risk premium doesn't disappear when the guns go silent. It gets priced into every future investment decision. Second, does this conflict accelerate the transition to the multipolar energy finance? Or does the dollar system prove resilient enough to absorb this shock? The petrodollar survived the 1973 oil embargo. It survived the 1979 revolution. Does it survive 2026? And third, do middle power like Pakistan convert structural geography into active diplomatic capital? Or do they remain passive, vulnerable bystanders, caught between the geopolitical forces they didn't create and cannot control? I don't know the answers. Nobody does yet. But these are the questions that will define the economic architecture of this region and global economy for the next decade. If this level of analysis is useful to you, the kind that goes beyond the headlines, that uses data to cut through the narrative, subscribe. I publish every week with this level of depth on the economies that matter most. The full source list in the description below. Every data point in this video is cited. Goldman Sachs, Oxford Economics, Chatham House, the WTO, Gulf International Forum, Al Jazeera's Economic Desk. Check my work, and if you are watching this from the Gulf, from Pakistan, or from the anywhere that is directly feeling the weight of this conflict economically, I want to hear your read. Leave in the comments. That conversation is genuinely useful to me and to everyone watching. Scan the QR code for the full written report and the source documentation at mohey-ud-din.com.pk or my Substacks newsletter. Thank you.